On a Tuesday morning in May of 1987, Eleanor Vance stood in the driver's seat of her battered Ford F-350, watching as the first rusted shipping container scraped along the gravel shoulder of County Road 7 in Clay County, Nebraska. County Road Commissioner Harlan Briggs stepped from his truck and said, "You're." Eleanor didn't flinch as Briggs' words hung in the dusty air. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, the brass key on its leather thong cold against her collarbone beneath the faded red flannel shirt. Harlan Briggs stood planted in the middle of County Road 7, his navy blue uniform shirt straining across his stocky frame, silver whistle glinting on its lanyard. That mole on his left cheek seemed to pulse as he jabbed a gloved finger toward the rusted steel box trembling behind her Ford truck. Missy. He'd called her Missy. Like she was some kid playing with matchbox cars instead of hauling 50 tons of potential salvation across his precious gravel. The air smelled of hot metal and crushed limestone, thick enough to choke on. She didn't look at him. Her pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the horizon where the flat Nebraska fields met the sky, wire-rimmed glasses fogging slightly in the humid May morning. "Let me tell you about rust chemistry, because you need to understand why Briggs thought he could stop her, and why he was dead wrong. Most people see rust and they see decay, the slow death of something useful. Robert Vance, her father, saw armor. He'd seen it in the cracked plowshares left in the barn after the '56 drought, the old tractor parts stacked like bones behind the machine shed. He'd seen it in the way certain metals didn't just flake away but formed a tight, protective skin. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late '70s? It buried them. But rust could save you, if you knew how to read it. Nobody was paying attention to Corten steel back then. Not the terminal operators sweating under the Nebraska sun, counting quarters while the port manager paced, frantic about the $10,000 quarterly penalty looming if those 50 containers stayed another week. Not the auction crowd elbowing for rusty pickup trucks and moth-eaten overalls, ignoring the thick manual titled Metallurgy for the practical man, its spine cracked, cover stained with what looked like motor oil. Eleanor had spotted it tucked under a crate of broken crockery, bought it for $2, and spent the next 6 months poring over its dense pages in the granary after milking. She'd been 28 years old for 3 months, running 80 acres of struggling corn and soybeans she'd inherited at 25 when her mother passed and Robert Vance finally let go of the reins. His broad shoulders stooped not just from age but from decades of watching the weather decide your fate. The farm wasn't failing, not yet, but the margins were tighter than a drumhead. Every dollar bled out felt like a punch. Robert kept the old ledgers in his corduroy jacket pocket, the silver chain holding his reading glasses looped neatly over one button. He'd show her the numbers sometimes, calloused fingers tracing the thin columns, seed costs climbing, grain prices dipping, interest payments swallowing whole fields. He never yelled. He just said, "The numbers don't lie, Nell, they just hurt." The terminal's problem was simple. Pay $10,000 every 3 months to keep those containers sitting idle or pay someone to haul them away. Eleanor had walked onto that lot the week before, drawn by the sheer, useless mass of them. 50 boxes, each 20 feet long, scarred with decades of ocean salt and port handling, their Corten steel surfaces blooming in rich, deep oranges and purples. To everyone else they were junk, eyesores, a liability, but Eleanor saw something else. She'd run her palm over that rust layer, feeling not the flaky weakness of ordinary corrosion, but a hard, almost ceramic smoothness. She remembered the manual, Corten steel alloyed with copper, chromium, nickel, designed to form a stable patina, not decay but a self-sealing barrier. The rust wasn't eating the metal, it was protecting it. Like bark on a tree, like the callus on her father's hand from the plow handle. She stood there, the smell of diesel and hot steel in her nose, the faint birthmark visible on her neck above the flannel collar, realizing the terminal wasn't just paying her $50 per container to remove an eyesore. They were paying her to take possession of 50 pieces of damn near indestructible building material, $2,500 total, a fortune for her right then, but not for what it could become. Robert Vance hadn't said a word when she brought the idea home. Just sat at the kitchen table, the worn leather wallet resting beside his coffee cup, the silver reading glasses perched low on his nose as he studied the figures she'd written in her cheap notebook. Cost of removal, $2,500. Welding rod, $500. Fuel for the truck and loader, $300. Total, $3,300. She hadn't mentioned the real cost, the months of study, the library trips to Lincoln for interlibrary loans on structural engineering texts, the quiet hours sketching in that same notebook while Robert fixed fence posts outside. He'd turned the pages slowly, his deep brown eyes missing nothing, the light freckles across the bridge of his nose stark against his light skin. He hadn't called it foolish. He hadn't called it brilliant. He just said, "I need to think about it," and pushed the notebook back. That was Robert Vance. No grand pronouncements. Just the weight of years, the knowledge that hope was a luxury you paid for with proof. His philosophy wasn't written in stone. It was written in the way he handled a wrench, the way he checked the grain in a piece of oak before splitting it. Rust is armor, not just for steel, for people too if they knew how to wear it. He'd learned it from his own father, a man who'd rebuilt a barn after the '47 tornado using salvaged beams nobody else wanted, beams whose grain told him where the strength still lived beneath the scorch marks. Robert carried that lesson in the quiet set of his jaw, in the way he never wasted a nail. Back on County Road 7, Briggs shifted his weight, hands planted firmly on his hips, the polished black boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "You think I don't know a road violation when I see one, Missy?" His voice was loud, meant for the two farmers who'd pulled over 50 yards back, watching. "That thing's wider than the legal limit. You'll tear up the shoulder, maybe the ditch. It ain't safe. It ain't permitted." He spat the last word like it was poison. He didn't see the calculations running behind Alina's wire-rim glasses. He didn't see the metallurgy manual's diagrams in her head, showing how the alloy elements in that Corten steel bonded with atmospheric moisture to form a dense, adherent oxide layer, a patina that slowed corrosion to a near halt. He saw a young woman in scuffed brown boots and dusty overalls, a girl really, trying to play at being a contractor. He saw trouble, he saw liability, he saw someone who needed to be put in her place. "You haul that eyesore off my road right now," he growled, "or I'll have the sheriff hook it up and tow it myself, cost you more than you're making." His laugh was short, sharp, devoid of humor, the sound of a man utterly certain he held all the cards. He didn't know she'd already measured the container's width against the road specs. He didn't know the terminal's removal contract overrode his petty jurisdiction. He didn't know she'd spent 2 years studying steel grain structures in library books while he sat behind his desk stamping permits. He saw only the rust. Robert Vance saw the armor. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Briggs waited for the flinch, the stammered apology, the retreat. Alina felt the familiar knot in her stomach, the one that whispered maybe he was right, maybe this was madness. She touched the brass key at her throat, cool and solid. She remembered the manual's words. The protective patina is not merely cosmetic, it is the functional heart of the material's longevity. It wasn't junk, it was engineered resilience, paid for by the terminal's desperation, sitting right there in the gravel. She looked past Briggs, past the idle curiosity of the farmers watching, out to the empty fields where her father's ledgers showed red ink bleeding into the future. She thought of Robert Vance, sitting at that kitchen table needing to think about it, not refusing, just needing proof. She had the proof in her hands, in the rust on that steel, in the numbers in her notebook. She didn't owe Briggs an explanation. She owed it to the farm, to the 80 acres breathing its last gasp, to the quiet man who taught her that rust wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something stronger. She shifted the truck into gear, the container lurching forward onto County Road 7. The truck rumbled down the road, the container bouncing behind it like a stubborn mule refusing to be led. Dust plumed in the late afternoon sun, coating Alina Vance's faded red flannel shirt and catching in the wire-rim glasses perched on her nose. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, the brass key on its leather thong cold against her collarbone. She could still hear Harlan Briggs, voice sharp as broken glass, his silver whistle glinting on the lanyard as he'd shouted about road violations and junk heaps. The container's wheels thumped over a rut, jerking the trailer hitch. Alina didn't flinch. She'd hauled worse than this. She turned onto the gravel drive leading to the farmstead, the tires crunching over stones the color of dried blood. Her father Robert stood by the weathered barn, silver reading glasses on their chain catching the light. He didn't wave. His broad shoulders were stiff beneath the brown corduroy jacket, the worn leather wallet visible in his back pocket. He'd seen Briggs' county truck speeding past an hour earlier, dust kicking up behind it like a warning shot. Robert Vance knew that look. Knew the set of a man's jaw when he'd come to deliver bad news or take something away. Alina killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, thick with what hadn't been said yet. She climbed down, boots scuffing the gravel. Her pale blue eyes met his deep brown ones. No hello. No small talk about the dry spell baking the cornfields to dust. Just the brass key swinging gently against her chest as she drew a breath. Let me tell you about that kitchen table because you need to understand where numbers become truth. It wasn't fancy. Just oak, scarred by decades of coffee rings and pocket knife blades, the kind of table where survival got calculated in pencil on butcher paper. That's where Alina spread it out that night. Not dreams, not hopes. Cold, hard lines of cost and possibility. She brought the Corten steel manual with her, the one she'd bought for $2 at the Elm Creek auction, its pages smelling of mildew and forgotten knowledge. Most people see rusted shipping containers and they see eyesores, landfill waiting to happen. Robert Vance saw something else entirely. He saw a gamble that could break them, but he pulled out his folding chair anyway, the one with the wobbly leg she'd shimmed with a matchbook. He sat down without a word, the worn leather of his work shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. Alina tapped the first figure with her index finger, $2,500. That's what the terminal charged just to haul those 50 containers off their lot. $500 each paid to get rid of the problem. She explained how the steel worked, how that rust wasn't decay, it was armor, Corten steel, self-protecting. The rust layer locked tight, sealed the metal underneath from further rot. The terminal didn't care. They just wanted the penalty fees gone. $18 a day per container, stacking up like unpaid debts. Let me tell you about welding rod because you need to understand why pennies matter when dollars are scarce. She depriced it out at the hardware store in Clay Center. $500 for enough rod to bind those containers together into something that could hold. Not pretty, but strong. Then $300 for the earth-moving, borrowing Harlan Briggs' own county grader for a day, fuel cost only. She scribbled the figures in her cheap spiral notebook, the pages filled with diagrams of load paths and stress points, margins crowded with calculations in her precise hand. The brass key felt warm now where it pressed against her skin, a small anchor against the current pulling at her certainty. Robert said nothing. He just pushed his silver reading glasses up his nose, the chain swinging. He reached for the calculator, the heavy, solar-powered kind with buttons that clicked like dry beans. He started punching in numbers, not fast, not slow, methodical, each digit a stone laid in a path he wasn't sure he wanted to walk. His broad fingers moved with the care of a man counting his last reserves. You know what a road commissioner's threat does to a farmer who lives by county permits? It freezes the blood. Robert finally spoke, his voice low, gravel in a tin cup. Harlan Briggs called me. Said you're hauling junk on County Road 7 like it's your personal highway. He's talking fines, talking revoking your hauling permit. Robert's eyes, deep set and tired, lifted to meet hers. What if this thing fails, Nell? What if that rust ain't what you think? What if it cracks when the wind hits it sideways? He tapped the Corten manual. This book says one thing, the ground says another when it's holding up your life. Alina felt the doubt then, sharp as a splinter under her thumbnail. She thought of the dry creek bed behind the South 40, the one that turned into a raging torrent every spring. Thought of the old barn roof that had groaned under last winter's snow. She remembered her mother's hands, chapped and red, sorting through canning jars at this very table, turning what others threw away into preserves that lasted through lean winters. Her mother was gone now, but the lesson remained. Material wasn't junk. It was just waiting for someone who knew how to see it. Let me tell you about earth-moving costs because you need to understand why risk hides in the details. Alina slid another sheet across the table. $300, that's the fuel for the grader. 1 day's work. But Robert, look, she pointed to a sketch of the south field, the gentle slope where the creek bent. We bury the base containers half in the ground, anchor them with the earth itself. The Corten steel, it bonds with the soil chemistry over time, it gets stronger, not weaker. The manual proves it, page 42. She turned to it, the brittle paper crackling. See. The alloy mix, copper, chromium, phosphorus, it reacts with moisture to form that stable patina. It's not fighting the elements, it's using them. Robert didn't touch the page, he just stared at the number, $300. He closed the manual slowly, the dust motes dancing in the lamplight above the table. His hands, broad and calloused from decades of gripping plow handles, rested flat on the wood. He didn't dismiss her, didn't call it foolish. He just sat there, the silence stretching like old baling twine. The only sound was the refrigerator humming in the corner, a steady rhythm against the weight of what was being asked. Alina watched him. Saw the way his jaw worked, the light freckles across the bridge of his nose standing out against his pale skin. He pulled the worn leather wallet from his back pocket, the one frayed at the edges, not to pay for anything, just to hold it, to feel the solidity of it. He opened it, though there was no money inside worth counting right now. Just old receipts, a faded photo of her mother, a folded deed to the land. He smoothed the Corten manual's cover with his thumb, the gesture almost tender. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The corn stood green in the fields under a clear sky. The county road was smooth and empty. That didn't last. Robert's voice broke the quiet. "You're asking me to let you tie up $3,300 on rusted boxes on a book bought for $2. He said it plain, no anger, just the facts laid bare like bones in dry earth. He pushed the calculator toward her. "Show me again." She did, slower this time. $2,500 for removal, $500 for rod. $300 for earth moving, total $3,300. She added it up twice on the calculator, the numbers clicking under her fingers. 3,300, not a penny more, not a penny less. She slid the machine back. The red LED display glowed like a warning light in the dim kitchen. Robert stared at the number. 3,300. It wasn't nothing. Not in 1987. Not with corn prices flirting with disaster and the bank breathing down every farmer's neck. He thought of the foreclosure notices piling up at the Clay Center post office. Thought of neighbors walking away from land their families had worked for generations. He thought of Briggs' laugh, sharp and certain, echoing down County Road 7. "Let me tell you about the difference between a gamble and a plan, because you need to understand why some people survive hard years." Robert reached for the Corten manual again. He didn't read it. He just held it, feeling the weight of the paper, the heft of the knowledge inside. He looked at his daughter, really looked. Saw the freckle just below her left eye, the stubborn set of her defined jaw. Saw the brass key on its thong, the same one her mother had worn when she sorted jars. He saw the notebook open beside her, filled with numbers that made sense only to her. Numbers that might be madness, or might be salvation. Doubt wasn't just hers anymore. It lived in the space between them, thick as the dust on the windowsill. Robert Vance, who'd survived the Dust Bowl as a boy and the price crashes of the 70s, knew doubt like he knew the feel of good soil. It wasn't fear. It was respect for the ground you stood on. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly on the linoleum. He walked to the sink, stared out at the dark fields where the containers now sat like sleeping giants. The moon cast long shadows across the prairie grass. He turned back. His silver reading glasses caught the light as he picked up the calculator one last time. His fingers moved over the buttons, slow and deliberate, adding, subtracting, weighing. The numbers were clean. The plan was thin, stretched taut over a foundation of rust and hope. But the numbers didn't lie, not these ones, not the ones she'd bled onto the page. Robert Vance set the calculator down on the oak table. The red LED display blinked $3,300 into the quiet kitchen. He didn't look at a leaner. He looked at the Corten manual, its cover worn soft at the corners. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just stood there, the weight of the farm, the weight of the years, pressing down on his stooped shoulders. Then, quiet as a falling leaf, he said the only thing he could say, "I need to think about it." 3 days later, Robert found a leaner at the edge of the south field where the cracked earth met the gravel road. She stood with her hands on her hips, wire-rimmed glasses glinting in the late morning sun, the brass key on its leather thong resting against the faded red flannel of her shirt. The calculator he'd left on the kitchen table sat open in her palm, numbers smudged by her thumb. Robert Vance, his broad shoulders hunched slightly beneath the brown corduroy jacket, stopped a few feet away. His silver reading glasses caught the light as he scanned the figures she'd written on the back of an old seed receipt. $2,500 for the 50 rusted containers, $500 for welding rod, $300 for earth moving. The terminal had been paying $10,000 quarterly to have those things hauled off, but Robert only knew the cost coming out of his own pocket. He said nothing for a long moment, the dust swirling around his black leather work shoes. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady like the creak of an old barn door. "You pay for the fuel." That was it. No congratulations, no warning about failure, just those 4 words and a nod toward the South 40 where the containers would sit half-buried against the floodplain. Alina tucked the calculator into her overalls pocket, her pale blue eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. He said yes. And that was enough. "Let me tell you about Corten steel, because you need to understand why those containers weren't scrap. Most people see rusted shipping containers and they see junk metal headed for the smelter. Robert Vance saw $2,500 vanishing into the ground. But Alina saw something else entirely, saw the way that rust wasn't eating the steel but protecting it. forming a tight, stable layer that locked out moisture. She de-learned it from a tattered metallurgy manual bought for $2 at a farm auction in York County, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with notes scribbled in the margins by some long-gone engineer. Corten steel wasn't failing. It was working exactly as designed. The rust you saw wasn't weakness, it was the armor. That manual sat in her back pocket now as she climbed into the cab of the old Ford pickup, the engine coughing to life. The first container waited at the end of County Road 7, its 20-foot frame listing slightly in the gravel like a tired beast. She hooked the chains to the truck's hitch, the metal groaning as she pulled forward. The container bounced once, twice, then settled into the bed of the truck with a hollow thud. She drove slowly south, the tires kicking up dust that coated the windshield. At the edge of the field where the earth dipped toward the Platte River's old channel, she stopped. This was the spot. The place where Floodwaters had swallowed 2 barns back in '52. She spent the next 8 hours digging, the shovel biting into the clay-rich soil, sweat stinging her eyes beneath the wire-rimmed glasses. She carved out a trench deep enough to bury the container's base 6 feet down, anchoring it against the sideways punch of rising water. The earth was cool and heavy in her hands, smelling of rain and time. When the container finally slid into place, she packed the soil around it in layers, tamping it down with the flat of the shovel until it held firm. The top 10 feet stood clear, rust bleeding down its sides like dried blood. It looked like a tombstone, but Alina knew better. She ran her hand along the steel's rough surface, feeling the texture of that protective rust layer. This wasn't the end. It was the foundation. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The container stood solid in its earthen cradle, the sun baking the rust into something almost beautiful. That didn't last. The next Tuesday, Alina was backing the truck up to the second container near the county road when a sharp whistle cut through the air. Not the soft chirp of a bird, this was metal on metal, sharp and authoritative. She looked up to see Harlan Briggs striding across the field, his navy blue uniform shirt straining at the buttons, the silver whistle on its lanyard swinging against his chest. His khaki pants were spotless, his black boots polished to a mirror shine. He stopped 10 feet from the truck, hands planted firmly on his hips, his bulbous nose twitching like a rabbit's. His hazel eyes fixed on the container, then flicked to Alina's face. "You know, hauling that thing across County Road 7 without a permit is a damn violation, Vance." He spat the words like they were bad meat. "State law. Federal regulation. You think this is some hobby farm where you can drag junk down public roads?" His voice rose, tight with the certainty of a man who'd written tickets for 23 years. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing. Not a mean laugh, not cruel, just the sound of a man who'd seen too many fools try to outsmart the system. A deep belly laugh that shook his shoulders, the gold signet ring on his left pinky flashing in the sun. "Good luck with that junk heap," he called out, the words hanging in the dusty air. Alina killed the truck's engine. She didn't flinch. Didn't raise her voice. She just stepped down from the cab, the scuffed brown work boots hitting the dirt. She reached into her overalls and pulled out the metallurgy manual, its cover worn soft at the edges. "Most people see rusted containers and they see scrap metal," she said, her voice calm as river water. "They don't see Corten steel." She flipped to a page marked with a strip of baling twine. "See this? The rust layer here, it's not corrosion. It's a protective patina, forms a barrier against further oxidation. The manual says it gains strength when exposed to weathering." She tapped the page with her finger, the callus on her index finger catching the light. "This steel was engineered to last 50 years in salt water. We're talking about floodwaters that rise and fall. It'll hold." Briggs stopped laughing. His face tightened, the small mole on his left cheek darkening as he flushed. He took a step closer, his polished boots leaving prints in the dry earth. "You're telling me rust makes it stronger?" He shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. "Girl, I've seen rust eat through tractor frames in 2 seasons flat. You're chasing moonshine." Alina didn't argue. She just held out the manual, the pages open to a diagram showing the chemical composition of Corten A iron, chromium, copper, phosphorus, each element playing its part. The chromium locks the rust in place. The copper slows the reaction. "It's not magic, Briggs, it's metallurgy." She let the words hang there, simple and unadorned. Then she turned and walked back to the truck, the brass key swinging against her chest. Briggs watched her go, his hands still on his hips, the silver whistle cold against his throat. He didn't say another word, just stood there as she shifted the truck into gear, the second container lurching forward behind it. The gravel crunched under the wheels, the sound sharp in the still air. Alina kept her eyes on the road ahead, the wire-rimmed glasses slipping slightly on her nose. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The work was speaking for itself. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at something the world had written off and saw what it could still become? Not tomorrow's miracle, not some grand vision, just the quiet certainty that this thing right here could hold. Alina felt it in her bones as she guided the truck toward the south field. The container bounced behind her, its rusted sides catching the sun. She thought about the manual's words, the protective layer forms within 6 months. She thought about the earth packed tight around the first container's base. She thought about the $10,000 the terminal paid every quarter to get rid of these things, and she drove on. The doubter's laugh still echoed in her ears, but it didn't shake her. It never would, because she knew the difference between scrap and material. It wasn't in the steel. It was in the eyes of the person looking at it. She reached the edge of the field and stopped. The second container waited. The earth was ready. And Alina Vance, her pale blue eyes steady behind the wire-rimmed glasses, her hand resting on the brass key at her throat, got to work. Harlan Briggs laughed, a deep belly laugh that shook his shoulders. Good luck with that junk heap. Welding the first ring of containers, Alina felt the heat sear her arms through the faded red flannel shirt. The acetylene torch hissed like an angry snake, spitting sparks onto the packed dirt where her scuffed brown work boots stood planted. Let me tell you about Corten steel, because you need to understand why that rust wasn't rot, it was armor. Most people see rust and they see death of the metal. Robert Vance saw a protective patina, the very thing that let railroads leave boxcars out in the rain for decades. Alina shifted her wire-rimmed glasses up her straight nose, the brass key on its leather thong swinging against her chest with every movement. She traced the torch along the seam where two 20-foot containers met, building up the weld in overlapping beads. One pass for penetration, a second for strength, a third to smooth the ridge. The Corten manual from the farm auction, $2 well spent, said the alloy needed that layered approach, like stacking bricks in a wall. The steel had already survived saltwater crossings and desert sun. It just needed someone to remember how it wanted to be joined. She stepped back, sweat stinging the small freckle just below her left eye, and wiped her forearm across her brow. The first ring stood complete, a fortress wall rising from the corn stubble of the south field. Let me tell you about Earth, because you need to understand why dirt is the oldest engineer. Alina walked to the edge of the newly welded circle, her pale blue eyes scanning the ground. The containers weren't just sitting on top of the earth, they had to become part of it. She'd calculated the compaction depth in her cheap notebook, the pages already smudged with grease and soil. Clay County soil was stubborn. It held water like a sponge but turned to concrete when dry. She needed layers no thinner than 6 inches, tamped down until they'd hold the weight of a freight train. Her father's old farmall tractor rumbled to life, the sound cutting through the quiet afternoon. She'd borrowed the earth-moving bucket, its teeth worn smooth from decades of plowing. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The tractor chewed through the topsoil, mixing it with clay dug from the creek bank, and she guided the bucket in slow, steady passes. That didn't last. By mid-afternoon, the wind picked up, whipping dust into her eyes and making the containers groan on their foundations. She ignored it, focusing on the rhythm: dump, spread, tamp, repeat. The earth had to be just damp enough, not wet, not dry. She de-learned that from Robert's old ledger, the one where he'd tracked rainfall against crop yields for 30 years. One layer done, then another. $300 worth of earth-moving labor measured in sweat and diesel fumes. She patted the soil with her gloved hand. Solid, unyielding, or so it seemed. Let me tell you about wind, because you need to understand why 40 miles an hour is the moment everything changes. The gust hit like a freight train, sudden and mean, snapping the cottonwood saplings at the field's edge. Alina barely had time to grab the tractor's roll bar before the top container in the second ring shuddered. She de-stacked them high, too high maybe, but the manual said Corten could handle the load if the base was sound. The wind screamed across the flat Nebraska prairie, finding every gap, every weakness. She watched, heart hammering against her ribs, as the container shifted sideways, its corner scraping against its neighbor with a shriek that set her teeth on edge. Sparks flew where metal met metal. The brass key burned cold against her neck as she ran toward it, shouting words she'd never say in front of her father. Damn it all to hell. The container settled back with a hollow thud, but the damage was done. A 2-inch gap gaped where the welds had held firm just an hour before. She ran her fingers over the seam, feeling the roughness, the give. not the weld's fault. The earth beneath had settled unevenly, shifting like a drunk man on his feet. Let me tell you about failure because you need to understand why it's never just one thing. Alina stood alone in the field as the wind died down, leaving only the creak of stressed steel. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the raw frustration of watching hours of work unravel in 60 seconds. She kicked the dirt at the base of the container, sending up a puff of clay dust. The earth packing, it hadn't been deep enough. She'd rushed the third layer, eager to get the second ring up before sundown. The Corten manual warned about soil compaction under uneven loads, but she'd skimmed that part, thinking she knew better. Robert's voice echoed in her head, measure twice, cut once, or you'll measure twice while you're cutting the third time. She dropped to her knees, digging into the gap with her fingers. The soil was loose, crumbling, only 4 inches down, not the 6 she'd promised herself. She'd tamped the top layers hard, but underneath, the clay was still soft, still shifting. A single tear cut through the grime on her cheek, hot and unwelcome. What if Briggs was right? What if this was all just a junk heap dream? She looked at the containers, their rusted sides glowing orange in the late sun. They'd survived ocean crossings and scrap yards. They deserved better than her impatience. Let me tell you about numbers because you need to understand why they don't lie. Alina pulled her notebook from the back pocket of her denim overalls, the pages fluttering in the dying breeze. She flipped to the cost ledger, the one she'd started the day Robert said you pay for the fuel. Welding rod, $3.40 per pound, she'd used 8 pounds so far. Earth moving, $300 for the tractor time and fuel. The containers themselves, $2,500 total, paid to the terminal to haul them off before the $10,000 quarterly penalty kicked in. Every penny accounted for, down to the last nickel. But the real cost wasn't in dollars. It was in the hours lost, the sleepless nights, the way Harlan Briggs' laugh still rang in her ears. Good luck with that junk heap. His silver whistle on its lanyard had glinted in the sun as he walked away, that smug certainty in his hazel eyes. She slammed the notebook shut, the sound sharp in the quiet field. The containers weren't junk. They were material waiting for someone to see what they could become, and she'd failed them. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you stood in a field, watching something you built start to fall apart, knowing the only person to blame was yourself? Answer it, then return to the story. Alina took a deep breath, the smell of hot metal and damp earth filling her lungs. She walked to the edge of the ring, running her palm over the rough Corten surface. The rust wasn't failure, it was proof the steel was doing its job, forming that protective layer against the elements. She traced the weld lines with her thumb, feeling the ridges where she'd built them up. Strong, solid, but the foundation, always the foundation, had let her down. She needed to go deeper, not 6 inches. 10, maybe 12, she'd have to tear up the earth again, start from scratch. The thought made her stomach twist. Another day lost. Another night of Robert's quiet skepticism hanging in the kitchen air. But there was no other way. The containers wouldn't lie flat unless the ground beneath told the truth. Let me tell you about soil, because you need to understand why it's the silent partner in every structure. Alina grabbed the tractor bucket again, the metal cold under her blistered hands. She dug out the loose earth around the shifted container, peeling back the layers like an onion. Topsoil first, light and crumbly. Then the clay layer, dense and gray. Below that, the subsoil, packed hard as stone. This was where she'd gone wrong. She de-stopped at the clay, thinking it was firm enough. But the subsoil was the anchor, the unyielding bedrock that wouldn't shift no matter how hard the wind blew. She revved the tractor, biting into the earth with renewed focus. 10 inches down, then 12. The bucket scraped against the subsoil, sending up chunks of raw Nebraska. She mixed in fresh clay from the creek bank, dampened it just enough, and began tamping again. Slow, deliberate. Each pass of the tractor a promise to do it right this time. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the field. Her muscles burned, her back ached, but she kept going. The earth had to be perfect. It had to be worthy of the steel. Let me tell you about doubt, because you need to understand why it's the heaviest thing to carry. As the light faded, Alina stood back to inspect her work. The container sat straighter now, the gap nearly closed, but the wind would return. It always did. She thought of Robert's face when she'd laid the calculator on the kitchen table, $3,300 total, including the fuel he'd make her pay for. His deep brown eyes behind those silver reading glasses, studying the numbers without a word. He hadn't called her crazy. He just said, I need to think about it. 3 days later, that single sentence, you pay for the fuel, No praise, no warning, just permission earned through numbers that added up. She thought she was ready. She thought the containers would stand. But the Earth had other ideas. She looked at her hands, raw and blistered, then at the containers looming against the twilight sky. The frustration tasted like copper in her mouth. She was so close, so damn close. And yet the wind had found the weakness in her hurry. She touched the brass key at her throat, the metal warm from her skin. Robert had given her the key years ago when she was just a girl learning to fix fence posts. This opens the tool shed, he'd said. But it only works if you know what tool to use. Tonight she'd used the wrong one, impatience instead of patience, speed instead of care. The sun vanished below the horizon, leaving only the pale blue glow of twilight. A leaner killed the tractor engine, the silence pressing in around her. She walked to the center of the ring, placing her palm flat against the cool Corten steel. It hummed faintly, still holding the day's heat. She closed her eyes, listening to the prairie wind whisper through the corn stalks. Tomorrow she'd start again, deeper, slower. The containers deserved that much. They'd been paid to be thrown away. They'd been called junk by men who saw only rust and weight, but they were still standing. They were still strong, and so was she. She turned to leave, her work boots crunching on the packed earth. But as she reached the edge of the field, a sudden gust of wind sent the top container shifting sideways, scraping against its neighbor. The sound was like a knife dragging across stone. She froze, watching the gap widen, the steel groaning under the strain. A sudden gust of wind sent the top container shifting sideways, scraping against its neighbor. She spent that night rereading the metallurgy manual by kerosene lamp, the brass key on its leather thong swinging against her chest as she turned each brittle page. Outside, the prairie wind still rattled the loose tin on the granary roof, but inside the cramped kitchen, Eleanor Vance sat hunched over the table, her wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the lamplight as she traced a paragraph with her finger. The freckle below her left eye seemed darker in the dim glow. Let me tell you about Corten steel because you need to understand rust before you can understand why this worked. Most people see rust and they see decay. Robert Vance saw protection. The manual explained it plain as rain. This wasn't ordinary corrosion eating through metal. It was a chemical dance where iron oxide formed a tight, stable patina that locked moisture out, sealing the steel beneath like a second skin. The very thing everyone called junk, a surface rough with orange flakes, was actually the armor. She'd known this when she bought the containers for $2,500, but now, after watching that top unit slide like a drunk man in the wind, she realized she'd missed the second law. The steel protected itself only if the ground beneath it stayed put. The gust hadn't broken the metal. It had exposed the weakness in what held it. Nobody was paying attention to soil compaction back then. Not Harlan Briggs with his county road maps, not the neighbors shaking their heads at her junk heap, not even Robert when she'd laid out the calculator figures. They saw dirt as dirt, something you drove over or planted through, never something that needed engineering. But the manual didn't just talk about steel. Tucked between chapters on tensile strength was a section on annealing, how controlled heating and slow cooling relieved stress in metal, making it stronger. Eleanor read it again, the words blurring at the edges from exhaustion. She closed her eyes and saw her father's hands smoothing the cracked earth of their fields after drought, pressing down with the harrow not once but 3 times, waiting for the rain to settle the dust between passes. The principle was the same: stress relief through incremental pressure, not brute force but rhythm, not one shove but layers. She sat up straighter, the spine of the manual cracking like a dry twig. The containers weren't shifting because the wind was strong. They were shifting because she'd tamped the base too fast, too shallow, like a kid stacking blocks. The earth needed time to settle, to bond, just like heated metal needed to cool slow. For a while things actually seemed fine. She de-leveled the ground, laid the first ring, welded them solid. The doubters had laughed, sure, but the structure stood. That didn't last. Now she knew why. The soil wasn't a foundation. It was part of the machine, and machines needed tuning. She flipped to the back of the manual where she'd scribbled notes in the margins, measurements from the auction book, calculations in her tight, practical hand. The ideal moisture content for compaction, 30%. Too dry and the particles wouldn't bind. Too wet and it turned to slurry under pressure. She checked her watch. 2:17 in the morning. Dawn would come in 3 hours, just enough time. She pulled her faded red flannel shirt tighter against the night chill and walked out to the south field. The moon hung low, silvering the stacked containers, their rusted sides gleaming like old blood. She knelt, scooped a handful of the earth she'd tamped yesterday and rubbed it between her palms. It felt wrong, crumbly where it should hold shape, dusty where it needed cohesion. Too dry. She remembered the manual's diagram, a cross-section showing how gravel sublayers drained excess water while clay locked in just enough moisture to activate the binding. She hadn't used gravel. She just pushed the dirt flat and called it good. Foolish. The kind of hurry that got you laughed at. She stood brushing soil from her worn denim overalls, the faint birthmark on her neck visible even in moonlight. Not the steel's fault. Hers. Back in the tool shed, she found the brass key she kept on a steel ring beside the door, a key to nothing really, just a habit from her grandfather, and used it to pry open the lid of an old coffee can. Inside lay a mix of pea gravel and river sand, scavenged from the creek bank last spring. She saved it for patching wagon ruts, but tonight it had a different purpose. She loaded a wheelbarrow with the gravel, then another with clay-rich topsoil from the north ditch. Each scoop was deliberate, measured. She knew the neighbors would call it madness, wasting hours on dirt when the containers were already stacked. But she'd seen Briggs' face when he'd driven past that afternoon, his silver whistle glinting on its lanyard as he shook his head. She hadn't answered his laugh, she just kept welding. Now she worked in silence, spreading the gravel first in a 6-inch layer, raking it smooth. Then the clay, sifted to remove roots and stones, spread thin as pancake batter. She took the tamper, a heavy steel plate bolted to a wooden handle her father had made, and began. Not one hard smash, not 10. She counted each pass, 5 taps per square foot, moving in concentric circles from the outer edge inward, just like the manual's annealing diagram showed, heat dissipating from the edges. Sweat stung her eyes beneath her glasses, but she didn't stop. She knew Robert would check the fuel gauge tomorrow. She'd pay for it, every drop. By first light the base ring was done. She stepped back, her scuffed brown work boots leaving prints in the fresh clay. The gravel layer was hidden now, but she could feel the difference under the tamper, a solid thud instead of a hollow thump. She needed proof, not faith, not hope, proof. She walked to the tractor, fired it up, and backed the front loader toward the stack. She lifted the smallest container, the one that had shifted yesterday, and set it down gently on the new base. Then she climbed into the cab, engaged the hydraulics, and slowly, deliberately raised the loader arms until the container sat at a 45-degree angle, balanced precariously over the ring. If the ground gave way, it would slide. If it held, she knew she was onto something. She watched the seam where steel met earth. No crack, no shift. Just the steady grip of properly compacted soil. She lowered the container back into place, her hands steady now where they'd been shaking last night. The wind picked up again, whipping her dark brown hair against her neck, but the structure stood firm. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you trusted rust to protect anything? Not paint, not varnish, not some factory coating. Just rust doing its quiet work while the world called it garbage. Eleanor wiped her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her pale blue eyes. She knew the answer. Nobody did, that was the whole point. She walked to the edge of the field where the old county road cut through the pasture. Harlan Briggs would come back. He'd see the containers standing where the wind had tried to move them, and he'd have to admit he was wrong. But that wasn't why she'd done it. She'd done it because the manual said it would work and the earth had proven it. The numbers didn't lie, the gravel cost nothing, just time to haul it. The clay was free. The fuel for the tractor, she'd track it in her ledger same as always. $8.70 for the tank she'd use tonight. She'd pay her father back before sundown. Next hour checking every inch of the base ring, tapping with a wrench handle to listen for hollow spots. Found one near the northwest corner, too little moisture in the clay mix. She dug out the loose patch, added a bucket of water measured to the exact ratio in her notebook, 20 parts water to 80 parts clay, and tamped it again, 5 passes at a time. The second layer held. Stronger. She checked her watch. 6:43. The sun was up, painting the containers in long shadows. She could hear Robert's truck rattling down the lane toward the house. He'd be in the kitchen soon, checking the coffee pot, waiting for her to come in for breakfast. She wouldn't. Not yet. There was more base to lay, more rings to build. She walked to the water barrel, splashed her face, and looked at her reflection in the still surface. The freckle below her eye, the wire-rimmed glasses smudged with sweat. She looked tired, but not defeated. Never that. The metallurgy manual had taught her one more thing: failure wasn't the end. It was data. Last night's shift had given her the numbers she needed, the moisture percentage, the tamping rhythm, the sublayer depth. She opened her cheap notebook, the one with the cracked spine she carried in her overalls pocket, and wrote it all down. not as a lament, as an instruction for herself, for whoever came after. She closed the book and tucked it away. The wind gusted again, stronger this time, but the containers didn't budge. They stood like sentinels, their rusted skins gleaming, holding fast against the prairie's breath. She nodded once, a small movement nobody saw, then she went to the shed for another wheelbarrow of gravel. The next morning she mixed the earth with clay and tamped it down in layers. Fitting the reclaimed steel shutters over the openings, she noticed warping in the noon sun. The edges curled like old paper left in rain, the flat planes twisting away from where they needed to sit tight against the container frames. Eleanor Vance wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her glove, the brass key on its leather thong swinging against her faded red flannel shirt. She'd driven 200 miles to Omaha the week before, following a tip from the county landfill clerk about a demolished factory on Carter Lake Avenue. The foreman there had waved her toward a mountain of twisted steel panels behind the wrecking ball's path. "Take what you want, lady," he'd said, spitting tobacco juice near her boots. "We're paying the city $50 a ton just to haul this junk away." She'd loaded 15 shutters onto her flatbed truck, each one pitted with rust but still bearing the ghost of factory paint, faded yellow stripes, the outline of a safety warning sticker. The man hadn't even asked for ID. Free material, he'd called it, like it was something shameful to admit. Robert Vance, her father, would have called it something else. He'd spent 30 years farming Clay County dirt, watching neighbors lose everything when the bank called in loans they couldn't pay. He taught her to see what others missed, not as charity but as arithmetic. Most people see scrap metal and they see useless weight. Robert Vance saw the tensile strength already baked into that steel by a mill he'd never visited, the load paths engineered before he was born. That was about to change. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The shutters sat flush against the container frames in the cool of early morning, their bolt holes lining up clean with the holes she'd drilled the day before. She deworked fast, using the heavy-duty drill Robert had given her when she turned 18, its motor humming steady in her grip. The brass key bumped against her chest as she tightened each bolt, a rhythm she knew from fixing fence posts after storms. By 9 a.m., the sun had climbed high enough to bake the steel, and that's when the warping started. First a slight ripple along the bottom edge of the first shutter, then a more pronounced bow in the center as the heat built. She watched it happen, the steel moving like it was breathing, expanding unevenly where the rust had eaten deeper grooves into one side. She'd read about this in the metallurgy manual she'd bought for $2 at the Elm Creek Farm auction, the one with the cracked leather cover and the previous owner's notes scribbled in the margins. Corten steel, the manual said, forms a protective rust layer but still expands when heated. Uneven thickness means uneven expansion. The factory shutters weren't uniform, some sections were thinner from years of wear, others thicker where welds had been patched. The heat wasn't treating them fairly. Let me tell you about thermal expansion, because you need to understand why 15 minutes of sunshine could undo a full day's work. When steel heats up, its molecules vibrate and push apart, making the whole piece grow. But if one part of the steel is thinner, say, where rust ate a groove, it heats faster and expands more than the thicker section beside it. That uneven growth creates internal stress, like two people trying to walk side by side but one taking longer strides. The thinner part pulls ahead, warping the whole panel. Most people see a bent piece of metal and they see junk. Robert Vance saw the physics already in play, the same way he'd seen the value in saving rainwater during droughts when others called it pointless. Eleanor knelt in the dirt, tracing the warped edge with her gloved finger. She could feel the tension in the steel, a faint hum under her touch. The manual had warned about this, uneven cooling after welding could cause warping too, but here the enemy was just the sun. She'd planned for wind, for rain, even for the weight of snow. She hadn't planned for the sun to become the problem. She spent the next 3 hours trying to force the shutters into submission. First, she loosened the bolts and let the panels sit free, hoping they'd relax back to flat as they cooled. But by afternoon, the warping only worsened, the steel holding its new shape like a grudge. Then she tried wedging wooden blocks between the shutter and the frame, tightening bolts incrementally to pull it straight. The wood cracked under the pressure, splinters flying into the dry grass. She wiped grit from her wire-rimmed glasses, the small freckle below her left eye stinging with sweat. Time for the brute force approach, she thought. She dragged the 50-gallon water barrel from the granary, sloshing cold water over the hottest sections of the steel. Steam hissed where the water hit, a sound like a snake warning her off. She kept pouring bucket after bucket, watching the metal darken as it cooled. For a moment it seemed to work, the bow in the center eased, the edges settling closer to the frame. She grabbed her wrench, tightening bolts as fast as she could, her knuckles white on the handle, but Corten steel doesn't like to be rushed. Cooling it unevenly, dousing one spot while another stayed hot just creates new stresses, new reasons to twist. She should have known better. The manual had been clear, controlled, even cooling is everything. She'd been too impatient, too sure she could outwork the physics. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Harlan Briggs started laughing, a deep belly laugh that shook his shoulders as he leaned against his county truck. He'd rolled up unannounced while she was still wrestling with the water barrel, his silver whistle glinting on its lanyard. "Look at this," he called out to no one in particular, gesturing at the warped shutters with his gloved hand. "Trying to build a fort out of trash, Nell?" He shook his head, the small mole on his left cheek twitching. "That steel's been rotting in a junkyard. It's got no business holding up against anything." Briggs had been the county road commissioner for 18 years, the kind of man who knew every pothole in Clay County but not much about steel that wasn't in a new pickup frame. His laugh wasn't cruel, just certain, the sound of a man who'd seen enough failed farms to know what madness looked like. Alina didn't answer. She just kept tightening bolts, her jaw set, the birthmark on her neck visible above her collar. She'd de-learned long ago that arguing with certainty was like shouting into a windstorm. Facts would speak for themselves, or they wouldn't. Briggs spat into the dirt near her boots. "Good luck with that junk heap," he said, climbing back into his truck. The engine roared as he pulled away, kicking up dust that settled on the warped steel like a judgment. That night, alone in the granary, she reread the metallurgy manual by kerosene lamp. The pages smelled of mildew and old tobacco, the previous owner's handwriting looping in faded ink. Section 4, paragraph 2, rapid quenching of heated steel induces thermal shock, creating internal stresses that manifest as warping or cracking. Controlled cooling allows molecules to settle evenly. She traced the words with her finger, the brass key cold against her palm. She'd done exactly what the manual warned against. Dousing the hot steel with cold water had shocked it, locking in new stresses that fought against the original warping. Now the shutters weren't just bent from the sun, they were fighting themselves, layers of stress pulling in different directions. She closed the book slowly, the leather cover creaking in her hands. Outside, the wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain. For the first time since dragging that first container off Harlan Briggs' scrap pile, she let herself wonder if he was right. Maybe this steel was just junk after all. Maybe the farm was too exposed, the idea too big for one person to carry. She looked at the ledger on the workbench, Robert's careful handwriting listing every cost. The $50 per container, the welding rod at $3.40 a spool, the earth-moving fuel at $27.90. Total, $3,300. A fortune for a farm hanging by its fingernails. She ran her thumb over the numbers, feeling the weight of them. Quitting would be easy, just walk away, let the containers rust where they sat. But Robert had taught her that arithmetic wasn't just about adding up costs, it was about seeing what others missed. The steel wasn't the problem, her approach was. The next morning she tried again. She hauled sand from the riverbank in 5-gallon buckets, piling it against the container walls to shade the shutters from direct sun. She mixed the sand with clay from the south field, just like she'd done for the foundation layers, creating a thick paste to pack around the steel edges. The idea was simple: slow the heating, encourage even expansion. By 10 a.m. the sand was baking dry, the clay cracking in the heat. The shutters still warped, slower this time but just as stubborn. She watched the top edge of the third shutter lift half an inch off the frame, the bolt holes no longer aligning. Her hands ached from gripping the wrench too tight. She thought about the Omaha factory foreman's smirk, about Briggs' laughter in the dust. It wasn't the steel failing her. It was her failing to understand it. She needed to work with the material, not against it. Corten steel wanted to breathe, to expand and contract with the day's rhythm. Forcing it rigid was like trying to hold a river in your hands. She sat back on her heels, the sun burning through her flannel shirt. The answer wasn't in fighting the heat, it was in letting the steel move, then guiding it back where it needed to be. But how? The manual didn't have a chapter for patience. It had equations, tolerances, cooling rates, not solutions for a woman with sand in her boots and time running out. She spent the afternoon measuring the warping with a straight edge, noting exactly where and how much each shutter bent at different temperatures. 11:30 a.m., top edge lifts 3/16 of an inch. 2p. M. Center bows 5/16. The numbers were precise, the problem undeniable. She mixed more clay paste, this time layering it thinner, packing it only where the expansion was worst. She left deliberate gaps for the steel to shift, planning to bolt it down only when the temperature stabilized. It felt like surrender, admitting the steel would never sit perfectly still, but it was the only path forward. By 4 p.m., the shutters held their shape within acceptable tolerances. The warping was still there, but it was contained, working within the margins she'd allowed. She tightened the bolts slowly, 1/4 turn at a time, checking the straight edge after each pass. For the first time all day, the edges stayed flush against the frames. Hope flickered, thin but real. Maybe she'd found the balance. Maybe the sand and clay trick could work. She stood back, wiping grease from her cheek, the wire rim glasses smudged with fingerprints. The compound was starting to look like something more than a pile of scrap. It looked like shelter. Then the wind shifted. A hot gust swept across the field from the west, carrying dust and the smell of dry cornstalks. It hit the shaded shutters full force, cooling the sand-packed sections faster than the exposed ones. The steel reacted instantly. One shutter groaned as the uneven cooling pulled it out of alignment. She lunged for the wrench, but it was too late. The bolts she just tightened screamed as the metal twisted against them. The top edge lifted an inch, then two, the straight edge clattering to the ground. She stared at the gap between shutter and frame, wide enough to slide her hand through. All that work, all those measurements, undone in 10 seconds of wind. The warping wasn't just heat anymore, it was the cooling too, the constant push and pull of the day's rhythm. Corten steel lived in that rhythm, it would never sit still, not really. She kicked the straight edge into the dirt, the sound sharp in the quiet field. Briggs' laugh echoed in her head, good luck with that junk heap. She bent to pick up the tool, her knuckles brushing the brass key at her throat. It felt heavy. Like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The sun beat down, relentless. She looked at the warped steel, the sand falling from its edges like tears. This wasn't just a setback. It was the material telling her she still didn't speak its language. She needed to learn faster or walk away. The shutters buckled again, this time with a loud metallic groan. She built a small forge in the granary, heating the shutters slowly. The groan still echoed in Nell Vance's ears as she banked the coal fire, her wire-rim glasses smudged with soot. She knew Corten steel's trick, it wasn't failing. It was remembering. Let me tell you about Corten steel, because you need to understand why heat matters before you can understand why Nell wasn't cursing that groan. Most people see rusted metal and they see junk. Robert Vance saw scrap iron worth $5 a ton. Nell saw a skin that healed itself, a chemistry lesson written in orange flakes. That metallurgy manual bought for $2 at the Clay Center auction had shown her the path. Heat it right, cool it slow, and the steel would stop fighting you. She adjusted the forge's draft, the brass key on its leather thong warm against her chest. Her father's voice drifted from memory, asterisk measure twice, cut once, but this was different. This was listening. The shutters had buckled because she'd rushed the cooling. Plain steel would have cracked. Corten just complained. Now she'd make it sing. Nobody was paying attention to Corten steel's memory back then. They saw rust and called it junk. That was about to change. Nell worked through the night, the granary smelling of coal smoke and hot metal. She de-built the forge from salvaged bricks and a broken tractor fan, its firebox no bigger than a bread oven. The manual's instructions were clear. Heat to 1500 degrees, hold it there for 20 minutes, then let it cool at exactly 30 degrees per hour. Too fast and the steel would warp again. Too slow and the protective oxide layer wouldn't form. She checked the parameter with a steady hand, her pale blue eyes narrowed behind smudged lenses. The freckle below her left eye stood out against the grime on her face. Outside, the Clay County wind howled like it always did in late May, rattling the granary's loose tin roof. But in here, it was just her and the steel breathing together. She de-learned this patience from Robert Vance. Not from words he'd never lectured, but from watching him mend fence posts at dawn, each twist of wire deliberate, each not tight enough to last but never so tight it split the wood. Measure twice, cut once. She'd written it in her cheap notebook beside the cost list. The forge bricks, 37 cents each from the demolition pile, the welding rod, $3.40, the coal, $14 even for the first winter. Total, $84.85, less than the price of one new shutter. The cooling took hours. Nell paced the granary's dirt floor, her scuffed brown work boots kicking up puffs of chaff. She de-packed the shutters in dry sand, insulating them like eggs in a nest. Every 15 minutes, she'd touch the sand with the back of her hand, feeling for the heat's retreat. Too hot and the steel would cool unevenly. Too cold and the stress would return. The manual called it annealing, a word that sounded like a promise. She thought about Harlan Briggs, the road commissioner, laughing when he'd seen her hauling containers. Good luck with that junk heap. His gold signet ring had glinted in the sun as he'd shaken his head, but steel didn't care about laughs. It cared about temperature. She checked the parameter again, 1,200 degrees, 1,100. The sand held the heat like a slow heartbeat. Outside, the first birds began to chirp. Inside, the shutters slept, their rust deepening to a rich, earthy red. This was the secret nobody saw. Corten didn't rust away, it rusted on. The oxide layer bonded tight, sealing the metal beneath. All it needed was time and the right touch. Nell's hands ached from the heat, but she didn't stop. She'd read the manual twice under kerosene lamplight, tracing the diagrams with her finger. Failure wasn't in the steel, it was in the hurry. Dawn came as she lifted the first shutter from the sand. It was warm but no longer hot, the rust pattern like tree bark. She carried it to the compound, her wiry frame straining against the weight. The expansion gaps were crucial, 3/8 of an inch between each section, just enough for the metal to breathe when summer baked the plains. She'd measured them with a caliper salvaged from her grandfather's toolbox, its numbers worn but still legible. Measure twice, cut once. She bolted the shutter into place, the holes aligning perfectly with the container's frame. No groaning this time, just a solid thunk as the steel settled. She worked methodically, the rising sun painting the compound in long shadows. Each shutter fit like a puzzle piece, the gaps almost invisible. By mid-morning, all 8 were secure, their surfaces already darkening in the humid air. She stepped back, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. The brass key swung against her flannel shirt. It wasn't perfect, nothing made by hand ever was, but it was right. The steel had stopped fighting, it was home. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The shutters held through July's heat, the gaps barely visible. That didn't last, not in Clay County, but this time the problem wasn't the steel. It was the eyes watching from beyond the fence line. Old man Peterson drove past daily in his pickup, slowing to a crawl. Mrs. Gable walked her dog along the county road, her gaze fixed on the compound's rusted walls. They didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just watched. Nell saw them from the corner of her eye as she welded the final anchor points. She knew what they saw, a fortress built from trash, rising where corn should have grown. They saw madness. Or maybe they saw something else, a stubbornness that mirrored their own, buried deep. She didn't wave, didn't offer explanations. She just worked, her posture military straight, the birthmark on her neck catching the sun. Let them watch. The proof wasn't in talk, it was in the steel. One Tuesday, Harlan Briggs' county truck pulled up without warning. He stood by the fence, his navy uniform crisp, silver whistle gleaming on its lanyard. His hazel eyes scanned the compound, lingering on the shutters. Nell kept tamping earth around the base, her back to him. She heard the gravel crunch under his polished work boots. "Looks like it held," he said, his voice flat. No laugh this time, just observation. She straightened, brushing dirt from her denim overalls. It was supposed to. He nodded slowly, his bushy eyebrows drawn together. "Robert tell you about the road permit?" She froze, her father hadn't mentioned it. Briggs pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Signed it yesterday, didn't think you'd need it, but—" He let the sentence hang. Nell took the permit, her fingers brushing his. The paper was crisp, official. She didn't thank him, didn't smile, just tucked it into her shirt pocket. "Appreciate it," she said, the words plain and final. Briggs turned to leave, then paused. "That's steel," he said, nodding at the shutters. "It's smarter than it looks." He walked back to his truck, the small mole on his left cheek stark in the morning light. Nell watched him go, the brass key cool against her skin. The permit was a truce, not an apology, but it was something. That evening, she sat on the compound's highest container, the wind tugging at her low bun. The setting sun turned the steel walls to molten copper. Below, the layered ring stood silent, 50 containers, each paid for with sweat and a $50 removal fee. She'd spent $3,300 total, $2,500 for the containers, $500 for welding rod, $300 for earth moving. Less than the cost of a new tractor. The neighbors' trucks had stopped coming. No more slow drives, no more stairs. They'd seen the shutters hold. They'd seen Briggs' hand over the permit. In Clay County, actions spoke louder than words. She opened her notebook, the pages stiff with dirt. On the last page, she'd written the numbers again, materials $84.85. Dealer price for one shutter $390. Savings $305.15 per shutter. She closed the book. It wasn't about the money, it was about the seeing. Most people saw rust and called it the end. She'd seen the beginning. The compound stood complete, layered rings of rusted steel, stable and strong. The spring of 1993 brought rain that would not stop. Day after day, the sky hung low and gray over Clay County, Nebraska, dumping water on fields already saturated from a wet March. Eleanor Vance stood on the porch of her father Robert's farmhouse, the wire rim glasses she never took off fogged with the damp air. Below her, the Platte River had swollen beyond its banks, turning the lowlands into a churning brown sea. She watched as the floodwaters crept past the foundations of the Peterson farm a half-mile east, swallowing their tool shed whole. The Petersons' barn, built sturdy but on low ground, groaned as the current hit its supports. By noon, the whole structure tilted, then collapsed with a sound like thunder rolling across the water. Further south, near the county road, the Henderson place lost 3 silos, concrete pillars dissolving into the mud like sugar cubes. Eleanor felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten, but it wasn't fear. It was the sharp, cold certainty of waiting for a test she knew the answers to. Her gaze kept pulling back to the compound she'd built on the high ground of the south field. 50 rusted shipping containers, each paid $5 for removal, formed concentric rings anchored deep into the earth. The Corten steel, that special alloy she'd learned about in the $2 metallurgy manual found at the Osceola farm auction, stood dark and unyielding against the rising tide. Let me tell you about Corten steel, because you need to understand why that rust wasn't decay, it was armor. Most people see rust and they see weakness, death of the metal. Robert Vance saw rust and he saw the same slow surrender that took his wheat fields in the Dust Bowl. But Nels saw the dense, protective patina forming on the container walls, a layer forged by the very moisture trying to destroy it. The manual had been clear, its pages brittle with age. Chromium, copper, nickel in the steel alloy reacted with oxygen and water vapor to create that tight, adherent oxide layer. It wasn't flaking away like ordinary rust. It was sealing the steel beneath, blocking further corrosion. She'd watched it form over 6 years, season by season, that rich, earthy orange-brown skin growing stronger with every rain. Now, as the floodwaters surged to 12 feet deep around the outer ring, lapping hungrily at the second layer, that patina was the only thing standing between the compound and the force of the river. She remembered the doubters, especially Harlan Briggs, the Clay County Road Commissioner, his sandy brown hair thinning on top, his gold signet ring flashing as he'd pointed at her first container being hauled down County Road 7. "Good luck with that junk heap," he'd bellowed, the words hanging heavy in the dust. Rusted tin cans won't stop a stiff breeze, let alone water. He hadn't understood. He saw scrap. She saw engineered material, already proven in ocean crossings, paid for only to be moved. The water kept rising, swirling around the base of the fortress, but the containers held. Not a single seam buckled, not a weld cracked under the immense pressure. The earth she'd painstakingly mixed with clay and tamped down in layers around the foundations absorbed the shock, holding the structure firm. While her neighbors' barns became kindling, her compound stood like a rock in the current. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you saw something written off as trash actually save a life or a livelihood? For Nell, it wasn't abstract. She walked the perimeter as the rain finally slackened, her scuffed brown work boots sinking slightly into the mud, the brass key on its leather thong cold against her neck. She checked the welds where the containers joined, the reclaimed steel shutters she'd forged in the granary holding firm against the receding water. She saw the dark, stable rust layer, untouched by the flood's assault. Inside the central ring, dry as a bone, were the Petersons' rescued livestock, the Henderson family's salvaged tools, even old Mrs. Gable's photo albums pulled from her flooded home. The tangible proof wasn't just the standing walls, it was the hard, cold arithmetic of survival. Rebuilding just one barn like the Petersons lost would cost at least $15,000 in 1993. Multiply that by the 3 farms whose main structures were gone, the equipment ruined, the feed spoiled. The compound hadn't just saved her own operation, it had shielded her neighbors' livelihoods from total ruin. $15,000 saved right there in the muddy field. Not a guess, not a hope, but a number as real as the wet earth under her feet. That number landed with the weight of the steel itself. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The rain stopped. The sun broke through, glinting off the still water pooled in the fields. Neighbors emerged, shell-shocked, surveying the wreckage. Then came the hard part, the mud, the cleanup, the slow realization of loss. But the compound stood. Its walls, layered rings of rusted steel, were unmarred by the flood's fury. The Corten steel had done exactly what the manual promised. The moisture hadn't weakened it, the rust layer had protected it. While ordinary steel would have been eaten through by constant immersion, this alloy had used the water itself to fortify its defense. She ran her gloved hand over the cold metal near the waterline. It felt solid, impenetrable. The knowledge wasn't magic. It was chemistry, metallurgy, the real science from that $2 book. She remembered the long nights rereading those pages by kerosene lamp after the shutters warped, after the wind shifted the top container. She hadn't given up, she'd understood the material better. The failure taught her about load paths, about how the earth needed to be compacted just so. Every setback had been a lesson written in steel and mud, leading her here to this moment of quiet vindication. No one had to tell her she was right. The standing fortress, the dry interior, the $15,000 in avoided losses, that was the proof. It spoke louder than any argument Harlan Briggs could muster with his silver whistle on its lanyard and his hands-on-hip stance. The doubt he carried, the certainty that rust meant ruin, had drowned in the floodwaters he never believed could reach 12 feet. His laugh, that deep belly laugh that shook his shoulders back in '87, now felt like a relic from a different, simpler time. A time before the rain wouldn't stop, and before rust became armor. You know what most people see when they look at rusted steel? They see the end of something. Robert Vance saw rust and he saw the slow, inevitable loss of value, the thing that couldn't be saved. Nell Vance saw rust and she saw the beginning of protection, the very thing that made Corten steel survive where others failed. She saw the chemistry at work, the alloy elements bonding with oxygen and moisture to form that unbreakable shield. She saw what the world paid to get rid of terminal storage fees piling up at $10,000 quarterly as the raw material for resilience. The world called it scrap. She knew it was already engineered, already proven, paid for only to be moved. The flood hadn't tested her courage, it had tested her understanding. And the understanding held. It held against 12 feet of churning water. It held against the weight of doubt from a man who knew every inch of Clay County roads but didn't know steel. It held while barns became driftwood. The compound wasn't just standing, it was performing its function perfectly, silently, the way good engineering should. The cost of that performance, the materials were free, paid $5 each only for removal. The welding rod, the earth moving, the fuel her father had made her pay for, it all added up to a precise figure she knew by heart. But the real cost, the one that mattered against $15,000 in potential losses, was buried in the details of the fix, the moment the system proved itself under pressure. She knelt by the lowest container ring where the water had surged highest. There, where a conventional steel plate would have buckled or corroded through, the Corten held. She pulled a small chisel from her overalls pocket, a tool her father had given her years ago, its wooden handle worn smooth by his hands. She scraped gently at the rust layer. It didn't flake or powder, it came off as a thin, dense sheet, revealing the solid, uncorroded metal beneath. The seal was intact. The system worked. She thought of the metallurgy manual, the precise wording. Protective patina develops over time through cyclic wetting and drying, forming a barrier that significantly reduces the corrosion rate. It wasn't theory anymore. It was fact, written in steel and water and survival. $11.40 in materials against a $390 dealer part, and it held. A week after the waters receded, Harlan Briggs walked up alone. So why did the man who laughed at rusted steel come back empty-handed? The answer hung in the damp air like the smell of wet earth and diesel. He stood at the edge of Eleanor Vance's compound, his navy blue county road commissioner shirt stiff with dried mud, the silver whistle on its lanyard glinting dully against the fabric. His sandy brown hair, thinning on top and combed carefully over the bald spot, was plastered to his forehead by the morning sweat. That gold signet ring on his left pinky caught the weak sun as he shifted his weight, hands planted firmly on his hips just like always, but his hazel eyes wouldn't meet hers. The small mole on his left cheek seemed darker against his warm ivory skin, like a bruise. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the creak of the compound's walls settling as they dried, that layered ring of 50 rusted shipping containers standing solid where neighboring farms had lost barns and sheds to the 12-foot floodwaters. Eleanor watched him, her wire-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down her straight nose, the brass key on its leather thong cool against her neck under the faded red flannel. She didn't move from where she'd been checking the earth fill between the containers, her scuffed brown work boots planted firm in the mud. The silence stretched, thick with everything he'd said months ago when she'd first dragged those containers onto County Road 7, how he'd called them a junk heap, a road hazard, a waste of good gravel. Now the proof was all around them, $11.40 in materials against a $390 dealer part had held back the river. She waited. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unused. His shoulders, usually so square and sure in that uniform, seemed to slump inward just a fraction. The pride he carried like armor had a crack in it now, visible in the tightness around his eyes, the way his bushy eyebrows drew together. He looked older, the receding chin more pronounced. Let me tell you about humility, because you need to understand how it feels to swallow your own words before you can understand why Harlan Briggs stood there trembling. It wasn't in the grand gestures. It was in the small things. The way his knuckles whitened around the whistle chain, the slight tremor in his voice when he finally spoke. 3 words flat and heavy as river stones dropped into still water. I was wrong. They landed with a finality that echoed across the field. No excuse, no caveat, just those 3 words hanging in the air like the damp chill. Aliner saw it then, the cost written plain on his face. The laugh he'd given her that day in the feed store, the deep belly laugh that shook his shoulders, had cost him this moment. The sound of long experience mistaking unfamiliar for impossible had finally caught up with him. He'd been wrong, and the knowing of it sat in his gut like bad coffee. He didn't look at her as he said it again, softer this time, almost to the ground. I was wrong. The admission didn't come easy. You could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his bulbous nose seemed to twitch, like he was fighting the taste of those words. He'd spent 23 years behind that county road desk, 19 of them as commissioner, and in all that time he'd never had to say them to anyone, least of all a 28-year-old woman dragging scrap metal across his roads. But the flood had washed away his certainty along with the topsoil. Most people see a rusted shipping container and they see scrap metal, something to be hauled off and forgotten. Robert Vance saw a fortress wall. That's what Aliner's father had known when he finally said yes to those 50 containers back in '87. He'd seen what the terminal didn't, Corten Steele's secret. How that rust wasn't decay, but armor. How the oxide layer sealed the metal tight against further corrosion, like a scab over a wound. He'd known because he'd read it in that battered metallurgy manual Aliner bought for $2 at the Clay Center farm auction, the one with the coffee stains on page 43. Robert hadn't argued with her plans. He just sat at the kitchen table, his silver reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, that light scatter of freckles across it catching the lamplight as he ran the numbers. $3,300 total, $2,500 for removal, $500 for welding rod, $300 for earth moving. He'd pushed the calculator toward her, the worn leather wallet in his back pocket untouched. I need to think about it, he'd said. 3 days later, he'd found her at the south field edge, the morning mist rising off the corn stubble. You pay for the fuel, he'd told her, and that was permission enough. Now, standing in the aftermath, Robert Vance emerged from the compound's shadow. His 6'1" frame moved slowly, slightly stooped as he always was these days, the brown corduroy jacket over his blue button-down shirt dusted with dried clay. He carried a steel rod in one hand, testing the packed earth between the container rings where the floodwaters had clawed at the foundation. His silver-gray hair was short-cropped, neat as ever, but his deep brown eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He stopped a few feet from Briggs, not looking at the commissioner, his gaze fixed on the seam where 2 containers met. He drove the rod into the earth fill, twisted it gently, then pulled it free. The soil came away clean, packed solid and unmoved. Briggs watched him, shifting his weight again, the black polished work boots sinking slightly into the mud. He cleared his throat a second time, louder this time, trying to reclaim some ground. State's sending a crew next week, he said, his voice rough. They'll need access. Good road. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform shirt, the khaki pants straining slightly at the waist, pulled out a folded bundle of papers damp at the edges. Gravel, he said, 20 loads for the approach road, counties covering it. His fingers fumbled slightly with the folds, the gold ring catching the light. It wasn't charity. It was payment for being proven wrong in the only currency that mattered out here, practical help. The gravel would stabilize the lane washed out by the flood, make the compound reachable when the rains came again. He held the papers out to Alina, not meeting her eyes. For a while, things actually seemed fine after the floodwaters dropped. The sun came out, the birds returned to the skeletal trees, and the county grader smoothed the main roads back into place. That didn't last. Not out here. Not when the land remembered every drop of water it had swallowed. Briggs's offer hung in the air, an olive branch wrapped in county letterhead. Alina took the papers, her pale blue eyes scanning the details, tonnage, delivery dates, the route approved. She didn't thank him. Didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. She tucked the bundle into the pocket of her worn denim overalls, the small freckle just below her left eye catching the light as she nodded once. Robert Vance straightened up from where he'd been crouched, testing the foundation. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his tan work pants, the faint birthmark on the right side of his neck visible above his shirt collar. He looked at his daughter, then at the compound walls standing unbroken against the horizon. His square jaw worked for a second, heavy brows drawing together in that familiar way. "You were right," he said. Just like that, 2 words plain as dirt. No fanfare, no smile. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who'd waited for proof and finally saw it standing solid before him. It cost him nothing to say it because he'd only ever been waiting for the evidence. Briggs flinched almost imperceptibly at the words, his hands tightening on his hips. He'd come here expecting to hand over the permits and leave, maybe get a nod, but not this, the quiet vindication of the man he'd dismissed as too cautious, too slow to back his own daughter's dream. Robert didn't look at him, just kept his gaze on the earth fill, tapping the steel rod against his palm. The moment stretched, filled only by the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. Briggs swallowed hard, the sound audible in the stillness. He reached again into his pocket, this time pulling out a smaller envelope, stiff with official stamps. The ink was fresh, dark blue against the cream paper. He held it out, his knuckles white around the edges. He handed her a set of road permits, stamped and approved. Over the next 17 years, Alina expanded the compound while the stamped permits gathered dust in Harlan Briggs' desk drawer. "Let me tell you about Corten steel, because you need to understand why rain was the friend, not the enemy, not the rust eating through weaker metals. Most people see rust and they see decay. Robert Vance saw oxidation building a protective skin. He taught her that long ago, his silver hair pulled back, the leather wallet always in his back pocket. Now Alina walked the perimeter every Tuesday morning, her wire-rimmed glasses catching the low sun, the brass key cold against her neck. She checked each seam where container met container, the earth packed hard beneath them. By 1995, the terminal called again. They needed 10 more 20-foot containers hauled away, $50 each for removal. Alina loaded them onto her flatbed without hesitation, the metal groaning as it shifted. Nobody was paying attention to those extra containers back then. They sat empty while neighbors focused on corn prices and drought forecasts. That was about to change. She welded them into a new ring around the original structure, filling the gaps with packed clay and river rock. No loans, no investors, just rust and resolve. The farm ledger showed $2,500 spent that year, all for fuel and welding rod. Robert Vance never asked for receipts. He just nodded when she handed him the notebook, his posture still slightly stooped, the silver reading glasses on their chain. "You pay for the fuel," he'd said 3 years earlier. She did. Every drop. "Let me tell you about solar water heating, because you need to understand why cold showers stopped being a winter fact of life in Clay County." By 2000, Alina had studied every page of that farm auction manual, the one with the coffee stains on the metallurgy section. She knew the sun's angle in Nebraska, how the container's southern walls caught the light longest. She scavenged old copper pipes from the county dump, bent them into serpentine coils, sealed them behind glass salvaged from a torn-down greenhouse in Grand Island. The parts cost $1,200. She paid cash from the egg money. Robert Vance watched her work for 3 days straight, his hands in the pockets of his corduroy jacket. He didn't say a word until the first stream of hot water hissed from the tap in the main container. Then he just grunted, "You were right," 3 words, no ceremony. The farm ledger showed the savings immediately $1,200 that winter alone on propane. Neighbors came by for coffee, pretending to admire the view, really staring at the steam rising from her sink on a January morning. They called it luck. Alina knew it was physics. She wrote the numbers in her notebook, the same one with the container sketches from 1987. The brass key swung against it as she worked. Let me tell you about emergency storage because you need to understand why empty containers became lifelines. By 2005, the floodwaters from the Platte River had jumped its banks twice in 5 years. 2 farms lost their grain bins entirely. Alina opened 10 of her empty rings to families with nowhere dry to keep seed corn or medicine. She charged nothing. 8 families moved in their most precious things overnight. The compound held. While others mopped mud from their basements, Alina handed out dry blankets from containers that never leaked. Robert Vance brought over jars of pickled vegetables from his own cellar, his tan work pants still damp from checking the north fence line. He said nothing to the families, just placed the jars on their makeshift tables. But that night over stew, he looked at Alina. "You were right," he said, again, just like that. The farm ledger showed no income from this, only the cost of extra nails and tarps. But the look in Mrs. Gabeley's eyes when she found her grandmother's quilt untouched that was worth more than numbers. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The compound stood quiet through 2 dry summers. That didn't last. The drought of 2008 cracked the fields like old pottery. Corn prices doubled, then tripled, but debts doubled faster. 18% interest choked operations that had borrowed to expand in the late 70s. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It ate equity like locusts. Banks called in loans. Auction signs sprouted in front of farmhouses all over Clay County. Alina watched it happen, her pale blue eyes steady behind the wire-rimmed glasses. She knew her compound cost less than some tractors, less than 1 year's interest on a big operation. Her notebook stayed open on the kitchen table, the pages filled with numbers nobody else saw coming. Let me tell you about solar arrays, because you need to understand why the lights stayed on when the grid failed. By 2008, Alina knew the next step. The sun still shone on rusted steel. She found broken photovoltaic panels at a landfill near Lincoln, glass shattered but cells intact. A retired electrician from Kearney taught her to test them, solder the good ones into strings. She mounted them on the south-facing walls, the frames welded from scrap angle iron. The panels, $5,800, the labor, $2,400, total $8,200 installed. Robert Vance studied the figures for 2 days, his silver hair catching the lamplight. Then he said, "You pay for the fuel." Same words as before, she did, every drop. The system charged batteries buried in a container lined with insulation from old refrigerator doors. When the grid went down during the ice storm of 2009, Alina ran extension cords to the neighbors' barns, kept freezers humming, kept calves warm, no speeches, no grandstanding. Just power where it was needed. The farm ledger showed the savings immediately $3,000 in the first year alone. Harlan Briggs came by one afternoon, his county road commissioner uniform crisp, the silver whistle silent on his lanyard. He didn't mention the containers. Just nodded at the solar panels, then handed Alina a thermos of coffee. Black, 2 sugars, like always. She took it without a word. The warmth in her hands said everything. Let me tell you about growth because you need to understand why small steps become foundations. By 2010, the compound breathed with quiet industry. 15 rings of rusted steel now, layered like tree rings marking hard years. The solar arrays hummed along the fortress walls, charging batteries that powered lights, a well pump, a small workshop where Alina repaired neighbors' tools. She kept the original metallurgy manual on a shelf, its spine cracked from use. Robert Vance still checked the welds every spring, his fingers tracing the seams, the light freckles across his nose visible even in the shade. "You pay for the fuel," he would mutter, but he never asked to see the receipts. The farm ledger showed steady black ink year after year. No big windfalls, just steady gains. $11.40 saved here on a welded hinge, $47 there by reusing conduit. The notebook grew fat with entries, the brass key swinging against its cover as Alina wrote. Neighbors stopped calling it a hobby. They called it smart. They called it necessary. When the drought hit in 2010, corn margins collapsed across Nebraska, but the compound stood. It always had. It always would. Because it was built on what the world paid to get rid of, welded together by someone who saw the truth in Corten steel. Harlan Briggs had called it a junk heap. Now it held the county's emergency supplies. By 2010, the solar arrays hummed quietly on the fortress walls. Then the rains came again in June 2010, harder than anyone remembered. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It broke half the county by 1985. Farms that took loans for new silos and bigger combines got buried when the payments doubled overnight. Men who'd fed their families for generations stood in courthouse yards watching strangers haul off their tractors. That debt hung like smoke over Clay County long after the banks moved on. Let me tell you about floodwaters because you need to understand debt before you can understand why the state would choose a rusted fortress over a brand new shelter. By the third week of June, the Platte River wasn't just rising, it was swallowing whole sections of County Road. Rain fell in sheets so thick it sounded like gravel hitting the roof of Nell's granary. She stood on the second-story catwalk of her compound, the brass key on its leather thong cold against her collarbone, watching the brown water creep toward the Southfield fence line. Her wire-rimmed glasses fogged instantly in the humid air, but she didn't wipe them. She knew the numbers by heart. The flood of 1993 had peaked at 12 feet. This water was already at 14 and still climbing. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The solar arrays hummed quietly on the fortress walls, charging the batteries that powered the lights inside. Robert Vance, his silver reading glasses glinting under the kerosene lamp, sat at the kitchen table of the main container unit, checking the water levels in the hand-cranked purifiers. That didn't last. By dawn on June 22nd, the river had jumped its banks near Elm Creek, cutting off County Road 7. Nell's compound, built on the highest ridge in the South Quarter section, became an island. Neighbors started arriving in pickup trucks up to their axles, then in rowboats when the trucks stalled. 12 families in all, mothers with infants swaddled in flannel, old men clutching toolboxes, teenagers shivering in wet jackets, all crowded into the layered rings of Corten steel. The shutters Nell had forged from warped barn doors held firm against the current, just like they'd held in '93. Let me tell you about those shutters because you need to understand Corten steel before you can understand why this fortress didn't collapse. Most people see rust and they see decay. Robert Vance saw protection. He taught Nell that rust wasn't weakness, it was armor. The metallurgy manual she'd bought for $2 at the farm auction explained it plain. Corten forms a tight oxide layer that shields the metal beneath. While other barns rotted from the inside out, her containers grew stronger with every storm. Harlan Briggs arrived by flat-bottomed boat just after noon, his navy blue County Road commissioner shirt soaked through to the khaki pants beneath. His silver whistle dangled from the lanyard around his neck, useless now that the roads were underwater. He stood dripping in the main courtyard, his gold signet ring catching the weak sunlight as he scanned the compound. His hazel eyes narrowed when he saw the solar panels feeding power to medical equipment and the hand-pumped well still drawing clean water. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing, not the deep belly laugh from 1987 when he'd called her containers a junk heap, but a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "You really thought this pile of scrap would save you, Nell?" he said, shaking his head. "State's got trailers rolling in from Lincoln, real shelters with running water and toilets." Nell didn't answer. She just pointed toward the ridge where the county's brand new emergency shelter sat half submerged, its foundation cracked from the pressure of the flood. Briggs followed her gaze, his face tightening as he saw the water lapping at the building's second-story windows. He turned back, his hands-on-hip stance faltering. "That thing wasn't built for this," he muttered. "It wasn't built for anything," Nell said, her voice flat. "It was paid for. Let me tell you about paid for because you need to understand risk before you can understand why the state emergency coordinator made that call." Every conventional shelter in the county had been financed through loans that came due when the interest hit 18% back in the 80s. Those payments had forced cuts to maintenance budgets, then to structural reinforcements. The county shelter's foundation had been poured thin to save on cement costs. Nell's fortress, no debt. No payments, just 50 containers bought for $50 each to clear them from a terminal's lot. The terminal had been paying $10,000 quarterly in storage penalties, money they'd rather give away than keep. Nell had seen the value where others saw only rust. Now, as the water rose to 15 feet, her compound stood dry inside while the county's debt-financed buildings drowned. By evening, the true weight of the situation settled on Briggs' shoulders. He watched a nurse use the solar-powered refrigerator to store insulin for diabetic evacuees. He saw teenagers charging cell phones with the reclaimed wind turbine Nell had rigged from old irrigation parts. Most people see scrap metal and they see trash. Robert Vance saw opportunity. Nell found him later that night in the main container unit, his leather wallet sitting open on the table as he counted cash to pay for extra medical supplies. "You were right," he said without looking up, the words costing him nothing because they were only ever waiting for proof. His silver reading glasses caught the lamplight as he slid a $50 bill into Nell's palm. "Fuel S on me this time. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you saw something the world had written off and realized it could still become something else? Not in a hopeful, vague way, but with exact numbers in your head." Nell had those numbers memorized. The $300 for the welding rod that sealed the container joints, the $14 for coal to keep the forge hot through winter, the $84.85 total startup cost that had saved $15,000 in potential losses back in '93. She knew because she'd kept Robert's ledger, its pages filled with his neat block letters tracking every penny saved by using what others threw away. That ledger sat open now on the workbench, next to the brass key she always wore. The rain didn't stop. It never does when the Platte runs high. By June 24th, the water had hit 17 feet, 3 feet above the '93 record. Neighboring farms lost everything. Barns ripped from foundations, grain silos floating like buoys, houses reduced to splinters. But Nell's compound held. The earth she'd tamped between the container layers absorbed the pressure, just like the metallurgy manual promised. The solar arrays kept the lights on while the rest of the county went dark. 12 families slept on cots in the dry upper levels, listening to the river roar against walls that had cost less than a used pickup truck. Briggs reappeared at first light, his county boat cutting through the swirling debris. This time he came alone, no whistle blowing, no hands-on-hip swagger. He climbed the metal stairs to the courtyard, his polished work boots leaving muddy prints on the steel grating. Nell met him there, the freckle below her left eye stark against her pale skin in the dawn light. "State S sending a helicopter," he said, his voice rough. "They need to know if your compound can handle more people." He paused, swallowing hard. "They're routing supplies through here instead of the county shelter." Nell didn't react. She just nodded toward the warehouse container where pallets of food and medical gear were already being stacked. Briggs watched a nurse unload boxes of antibiotics, then turned back to Nell. The gold ring on his pinky caught the light as he dug into his pocket. He pulled out a folded permit, road access, emergency use, stamped with the county seal. "You were wrong," he said, the 3 words hanging heavy in the wet air. Then he did something practical. He assigned 2 county workers to help Nell's team unload the helicopter when it arrived. "Let me tell you about that helicopter because you need to understand scale before you can understand the shift. It wasn't just one chopper, it was the state's entire emergency response network pivoting toward a fortress built from scrap. While conventional shelters sat underwater, Nell's debt-free compound became the hub. The state coordinator needed a place that wouldn't collapse, couldn't be repossessed, and didn't require fuel deliveries to function. Her solar arrays hummed quietly on the fortress walls, her hand-pumped well drew clean water, and her Corten steel walls deflected the current like a rock in a stream. Every dollar the county had borrowed for modern shelters had come with a hidden cost, the cost of failure when the river rose too high. Nell's containers had no such cost. They'd been paid for twice over, first by the terminal to clear their lot, then by the river itself proving their worth. The rains finally broke on June 27th. Sunlight cut through the clouds, glinting off the water that still covered the lower fields. Briggs stood at the edge of the compound, watching volunteers distribute meals from the warehouse container. His silver whistle hung silent against his soaked shirt. He turned to Nell, his voice barely audible over the river's retreat. "Hardest thing I ever did," he said, "was admit you saw what I couldn't." He didn't mention the laughter from 23 years earlier. He didn't need to. The mud on his boots, the permit in Nell's hand, the 12 families sleeping dry inside, it all echoed louder than words. Most people see a pile of rusted containers and they see junk. Harlan Briggs saw a lifeline. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, casting long shadows across the flooded fields, Nell climbed the catwalk one last time. Below her, the compound buzzed with activity, volunteers sorting supplies, nurses checking vitals, children drawing on the steel walls with chalk. The brass key felt warm against her skin now, no longer cold. She thought of the metallurgy manual's worn pages, the exact figures for tensile strength and oxide layers, the way Robert had reviewed her numbers with that same careful skepticism before saying yes. She thought of Briggs' laugh in the machine shop lot, so certain of his experience, so blind to what rust could become. The state emergency coordinator radioed, "We're routing all relief through Vance compound." As the floodwaters receded from Clay County, Nebraska, leaving behind a thick sludge of silt and broken fence posts, a young woman pulled up in a dusty blue pickup truck. The tires spun slightly in the mud before catching. She stepped out, 25 years old, with Alina Vance's same pale blue eyes but her mother's darker hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Sarah Vance carried a worn ledger book under one arm, its cover stained with coffee rings and grease smudges. Alina stood at the edge of the compound, wire-rimmed glasses catching the low morning sun, the brass key on its leather thong cool against her neck. She watched her niece approach without hurrying, taking in the way Sarah moved, shoulders squared like Robert's had been, that same military straight posture. Nobody was paying attention to what Sarah carried back then. It was just another ledger in a county full of them, filled with numbers nobody thought mattered. That was about to change. Sarah stopped a few feet away, boots caked in dried river mud. She didn't say hello, just opened the ledger to a page near the middle and held it out. Alina saw her own handwriting first, columns of figures from the early 90s, the cost of welding rod, the price of coal for the forge, the savings from salvaged timber. Then Sarah's writing took over. Neater, tighter lines. Entries dated every third Tuesday since 2005. Fuel costs, maintenance on the solar array. The exact weight of gravel added to reinforce the eastern wall after the 2007 storms. Not estimates, not guesses, real numbers. $11.40 for a replacement hinge last spring. $390 saved by patching the drainage ditch instead of calling a contractor. Sarah had been tracking the fortress's savings for 5 years without anyone asking her to. For a while, things actually seemed fine after the floodwaters dropped. The compound stood solid, Corten steel walls still streaked with mud but holding firm, the solar panels humming as they charged the batteries. Neighbors were already talking about how Alina's crazy container fortress had saved more than just her farm, it had become the county's lifeline. That didn't last. Sarah flipped the ledger to a fresh page. This one held a different kind of math. Angles, load calculations. Tensile strength ratings for aluminum alloy 7075T6. Sketches of curved blades, notched hubs, wiring diagrams. Scrap airplane parts, Sarah said, her voice steady but low. Omaha International's got a DC-10 tail section rotting in their salvage yard. They're paying to have it crushed next month. She tapped the sketch with her finger. The skin's perfect, already shaped, already tested. We melt it down, cast new hubs from the engine mounts, use the landing gear struts for the tower frame. Alina felt the familiar weight of doubt press against her ribs. She'd stood where Sarah stood now. In 1987, holding a metallurgy manual bought for $2 at a farm auction, explaining Corten steel's self-healing rust to a father who needed proof. Back then, the numbers had felt impossible. Now they were her language. Sarah slid a second sheet from her back pocket, not a sketch, a cost list, itemized. The aluminum skin, free for removal. The casting mold, $120 in sand and clay. Welding rod for assembly, $23.60. The old tractor battery to store the power, $37 at the salvage yard. Total, $180.60. Less than the price of a single commercial turbine blade. Alina looked past Sarah to the compound. The 50 containers, bought for $2,500 back in '87, now formed walls that had held against floodwaters Robert Vance never lived to see. He died in 2002, just before the droughts hit hard, his last words to her about checking the ledger before planting season. She remembered the silence in the kitchen when she'd first laid out the container plan. Robert reading the numbers slowly, not dismissive, just needing to see the shape of the risk. "I need to think about it," he'd said. 3 days later, permission granted with one sentence, "You pay for the fuel." Now Sarah stood here not asking permission, just showing the work already done. Let me tell you about that ledger book, because you need to understand what Robert Vance taught his daughter before you can understand why Sarah didn't ask for anything but time. Most people see a rusted shipping container and they see junk metal taking up space. Robert Vance saw 50 years of weathering already proven against the plane's wind. Sarah saw airplane skin that had flown through hurricanes and landed on ice. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at something the world had written off and saw what it could still become? Sarah waited, the ledger open in her hands, the breeze flipping a page to show a column of dates and figures tracking every penny the fortress had saved the county since 1993. The flood relief operation alone had moved 5 tons of supplies through these walls, saving the county emergency fund thousands. Sarah hadn't added that total yet. She would, in her neat, precise handwriting, on the third Tuesday. Alina reached out not for the ledger but for the brass key on its leather thong. She rubbed her thumb over the worn edges, feeling the ghost of Robert's hand guiding hers in the granary back in '87. The first container had nearly shifted that day, scraping against its neighbor with a sound like tearing metal. Dee spent the night rereading the metallurgy manual by kerosene lamp, learning how Corten steel's alloy fought rust instead of surrendering to it. Sarah didn't need to spend that night. She'd already done the work. The numbers were real. The aluminum alloy specs matched the salvage yard inventory she'd copied down. The cost list added up. $180.60 against a commercial turbine costing $8,000 new. Alina thought of Harlan Briggs, the road commissioner who'd laughed at her container idea back in '87. Good luck with that junk heap. He'd barked, hands on his hips, silver whistle glinting on its lanyard. The silence had lasted about 2 seconds. Then he'd started laughing, a deep, rolling sound that shook his shoulders, the laugh of a man who'd seen every half-baked scheme in Clay County and knew this one was no different. He'd been decent, and he'd been dead wrong, just like Robert had been wrong to doubt until the proof stood solid against the 1993 flood. The difference was Sarah hadn't asked. She just built the knowledge like Alina had, like Robert had before them both. Alina looked at her niece, really looked, saw the same stubborn set of the jaw she'd seen in the mirror at 28. Saw the way Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the ledger the same way Robert's had traced crop yields in his own book. The farm wasn't for sale. The drought came, the corn margins collapsed, the fortress lived. And now here was Sarah, standing in the mud with a plan written in aluminum and angles, not asking for permission but offering partnership. Alina didn't need to think about it. She didn't need fuel money or a calculator. The work was already done. The numbers added up. The material was free for the taking. She took the ledger from Sarah's hands, flipped to a blank page near the back and wrote 3 words at the top. Not a question, not a request, a statement. Start building. Then she handed the book back. Sarah nodded once, no smile, just the quiet satisfaction of work recognized. She opened her laptop, the screen glowing in the morning light, showing schematics for wind turbines made from scrap airplane parts. Alina walked Sarah to the edge of the compound, the rusted walls glowing in the sunset like embers from a long-burning fire. Her brass key on the leather thong swung against the faded red flannel as she stopped, the pale blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses taking in the layered rings of Corten steel. Sarah Vance, 25 years old with the same straight nose and defined jawline, held her laptop open, the schematics for wind turbines made from scrap airplane parts glowing in the twilight. The air smelled of damp earth and hot metal, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes for days after working the compound. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at what the world wrote off and saw what it could become? Not as a dream, not as a maybe, but as something real you could hold in your hands and build with. Because that was the gift Alina Vance carried in her pocket every single day. The gift nobody saw coming back in May 1987, when she stood in that gravel lot behind the terminal watching those 50 20-foot containers get loaded onto her truck for $2,500. Nobody was paying attention to rusted steel back then. They saw scrap, trash, an eyesore waiting for the crusher. That was about to change. Most people see rust and they see decay, the slow surrender to time. Robert Vance, her father, saw the grain in the metal, the way the Corten steel manual he bought for $2 at that farm auction described it. He saw how the oxide layer protected the core, how it was engineered to weather the plains' storms without flaking away. He saw what the terminal manager paid $10,000 quarterly to keep off his lot. And he saw his daughter, 28 years old with that military straight posture and the freckle below her left eye, standing there with a calculator and a plan written in a cheap notebook. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Harlan Briggs started laughing. It was the deep belly laugh of a man who'd spent 30 years as Clay County Road Commissioner, the laugh of someone who'd seen every kind of foolishness roll down County Road 7. He shook his shoulders, the silver whistle on his lanyard bouncing against his navy blue uniform shirt, the mole on his left cheek turning pink with mirth. Good luck with that junk heap, he'd said, the words hanging in the dusty air like smoke. The farm is not for sale, Alina had answered short and plain, then shifted the truck into gear. The container lurched forward onto County Road 7. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The first ring of containers sat solid in the earth tamped down with clay. That didn't last. The wind shifted one afternoon, sent the top container scraping against its neighbor with a shriek that carried to the feed store. Alina spent that night under the kerosene lamp, rereading the metallurgy manual's pages on load paths and thermal expansion. She mixed the earth finer the next morning, tamped it slower. She learned. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It ate them alive. Foreclosed farms stood like tombstones across Clay County, Nebraska, but the Vance compound wasn't built on borrowed money. It was built on $2,500 paid to take someone else's problem away. On $500 for welding rod bought in bulk from the machine shop in Clay Center. On $300 for earth moving borrowed from Robert's savings, paid back with the first year's savings on feed storage. $3,300 total. Robert Vance had set the calculator down that first night in the kitchen, the worn leather wallet resting beside it on the oilcloth. I need to think about it, he'd said, his silver reading glasses catching the lamplight. 3 days later, standing by the south field where Alina was marking the first footprint, he'd given his permission with one short sentence. You pay for the fuel, and she did, every drop, every single one. Let me tell you about the ledger, because you need to understand where the real value lived before you can understand why the state emergency coordinator showed up in June 2010. It wasn't in the soaring numbers, not really. It was in the quiet lines Robert started keeping without being asked. After the 1993 floodwaters reached 12 feet and the fortress held while neighboring farms lost barns, saving $15,000 in potential losses. The ledger sat in the granary office, its pages filled with Alina's neat script: welding rod $3.40, earth clay $8, coal for the stove $14, total $84.85 for the first winter's heating. Set against dealer prices for flood barriers that ran $390, the arithmetic held. It always held. By 2010, the compound wasn't just Alina's fortress. It was Clay County's disaster hub, state-certified and stamped. 5 tons of relief supplies rooted through its walls during the record floods. 12 families housed in its dry, rusted corridors. Harlan Briggs walked up alone a week after the waters receded, just like he had after the '93 flood. He didn't laugh this time. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of being wrong. I was wrong, he said, 3 words that cost him something you could see in the way his hands gripped the silver whistle. Then he handed over the road permits for the new access lane, stamped and approved. Robert Vance, standing beside Alina, looked at the compound, then at his daughter. You were right, he said, and it cost him nothing because he'd only ever been waiting for proof. Let me tell you about the brass key, because you need to understand what Alina Vance carried before you can understand why she didn't flinch when Sarah opened that laptop. It wasn't a key to anything locked. It was a key to the granary workshop where Robert Vance kept his tools after he retired from the farm. It was the key he'd used to lock the door every night for 40 years, the key he'd pressed into Alina's hand the day he signed the deed over. She wore it on the leather thong because it was the weight of knowing where you stood. The weight of seeing what others missed. Sarah traced a finger over the laptop screen, pointing to the rotor assembly made from salvaged airplane wings. Scrap metal, Aunt Alina, she said, but the right kind. The kind that's already been engineered. Alina nodded, the brass key cool against her skin. She remembered the metallurgy manual's spine cracking as she opened it for the first time, the smell of dust and oil in that granary workshop. She remembered the doubters, the failures, the nights when quitting sat heavy in the silence. The farm is not for sale, she told them all, and it never was. Let me tell you about the numbers, because you need to understand the truth before you can understand the legacy. $3,300 paid out over 7 months in 1987, $220,000 in verified value by 2010. Not in cash but in saved losses in shelter provided in the 15-kilowatt solar array humming quietly on the fortress walls, installed for $8,200. In the trust earned when the state routed supplies through rusted steel others called junk. The arithmetic didn't lie. It never had. The difference between scrap and material was almost entirely a question of who was looking at it, and Alina Vance had always been looking. Sarah closed the laptop, the screen darkening to reflect the compound walls. Eleanor walked her niece back toward the house, the scuffed brown work boots crunching on gravel. Robert Vance sat on the porch, the silver reading glasses on his nose as he read the Clay County Chronicle, the worn leather wallet in his back pocket. He looked up, his deep brown eyes meeting Eleanor's. She didn't need to say anything. The compound stood. The farm was not for sale. The drought came. The corn margins collapsed. The fortress lived.